Good morning. Thank you for joining us this Sunday morning at Colonial Hill Baptist Church. I'm Ernie Armstrong, and it's my privilege to lead in Bible study this morning from Colonial Hill. Today, we start essentially the second half of this quarter's lesson, where we will be spending the rest of the quarter studying from Daniel. Daniel is a contemporary of Jeremiah and Ezekiel, and since we've been studying from Ezekiel, a lot of the background information is the same. But it doesn't hurt to recover some of that before we actually start talking about what Daniel had to say and maybe have a very general discussion to start with about what Daniel may be talking about. Daniel is probably, there are some disputes, if you will, among scholars as to the time of writing of the book of Daniel. There are some who question that Daniel is the author of the book of Daniel. Those who challenge it and question Daniel's authorship essentially are those who would disbelieve that a prophet of God can predict what the future is going to behold. And because towards the end of Daniel, the deep prophecy sections of Daniel, Daniel is talking about prophecies that do not occur until 300 years later, during the second, or 300 to 400 years later, during the period of time, 400 years when there was no word from God, just before Jesus. They suggest that Daniel's prophecies are too accurate, therefore it could not have been written 300 to 400 years before. It must have been written by somebody claiming to be Daniel and writing after the events that were prophesied actually took place. Well, that's sort of well and good, except for one serious problem with those who challenge Daniel's authorship. That one problem is Jesus. In Matthew 24, verse 15, Matthew reported that Jesus said, "So when you see standing in the holy place the abomination that causes desolation, spoken of through the prophet Daniel, let the reader understand." In other words, Jesus accepts that Daniel is the author. And that, to me, makes those who have problem with the accuracy of his prophecies, just be somebody who has problems with God's authority, God's sovereignty, and his ability to, through his prophets, proclaim that which is to come, and even to proclaim it in such a fashion as if it had already occurred. So let's get back to Daniel. Daniel, as I said, is a contemporary of Ezekiel and of Jeremiah. The Babylonians invade Jerusalem in 605 BC, and they take off into exile to Babylon. Many of the royal family or lineage or the members of royal family. Let's look at that 605 date, because you might remember when we talked about Ezekiel, Ezekiel, we say, was carried into captivity by Nebuchadnezzar, king of the Babylonians, in 597, the 597 invasion or siege of Jerusalem, when he was carried out into exile. So which is it, 605 or 597? The answer is it's both. And in fact, there is a third and final siege in 587 BC when Nebuchadnezzar destroys Jerusalem. So what is Nebuchadnezzar doing invading Jerusalem? Isn't Babylonia a good distance away? One commentary I was looking at said it would be a journey of about 500 miles. It's not as the crow flies, but as the journey would take them from Babylonia or Babylon to Jerusalem. So what is Nebuchadnezzar doing there in Jerusalem? Well, we need to look at a little world history. Now, 2 Kings chronicles a lot of this, but world history also teaches us that the nation of Israel, after Solomon, had divided into two kingdoms, a northern kingdom consisting of 10 tribes of Israel, and they were called Israel. The southern two tribes remained. The northern tribes didn't physically separate, they politically separated. The southern two tribes took the name of the largest of the remaining two tribes of Israel, and that's Judah. That's where Jerusalem is located. After Solomon, both northern kingdom and southern kingdoms had the same number of kings. They each had 20 kings. And something just hit me that makes me wonder if that's true. If it's a total of 20, but I think it's each had 20. I'm trying to remember my notes. And maybe I can look real quickly to see, but it's not that important that we should spend a whole lot of time trying to find out if that's right or not. The southern kingdom had good kings and some bad kings. The northern kingdom had no good kings whatsoever. Let's see, I know where my notes are, and I can look and see maybe for those of you who really, yes, 20 and 20. Out of the 20 kings who ruled in the southern kingdom, Judah, 7 of them were generally considered to be godly kings. None of the kings of the northern kingdom were ever considered to be godly kings. They chased after idols, worshipped idols, as we saw Ezekiel condemning them and pointing out that God had caused them to be defeated and the northern kingdom essentially destroyed. It was because of their worship of idols. Ezekiel called it, or through God, God through Ezekiel called it prostitution or spiritual adultery. And they even sacrificed their own children to the gods, the idols they worshipped. But the southern kingdom had godly kings. The Assyrians invaded Israel, the northern 10 tribes, carried those people off into exile and dispersed them, and that northern kingdom the people never came back as a cohesive group. Babylon defeated Assyria in world history and then ultimately invaded Israel and Jerusalem. Why would they do that? Quite frankly, Israel was not a big enough nation to threaten them. Well, Israel, or the southern kingdom, Judah, aligned itself with Egypt. And the Pharaoh of Egypt attacked the Babylonians. And the Egyptians were being supported by the Israelites, those from Judah, who aligned themselves with the Egyptians. The idea being, on the part of Israel or Judah, that they needed a big nation to protect them from the world spread of the Babylonians. The problem is, once the Babylonians defeated the Egyptians and chased them back to Sinai and on back to Egypt, now the Babylonians are in the area and they're not happy with the king of Judah. And so they invade Jerusalem. They besiege Jerusalem. They are victorious. They kill many. They take lots of the gold objects out of the temple, Solomon's temple in Jerusalem, and carry them off to their temple back in Babylonia or in Babylon, sort of suggesting that their God in their temple was better than the Jerusalem God or the God of the Israelites, because Babylon won. And they carried the young men back to Babylon in exile. So the book of Daniel starts with Nebuchadnezzar's siege of Judah and Jerusalem. So why did God allow Judah to be besieged and, in essence, defeated? Well, it goes back to what we have been alluding to and talking about from Ezekiel. That is, the people of God had turned to idols. And in spite of his admonitions, they had done detestable things in God's sight. And they would not turn back to God. And so God used the Babylonians to inflict his judgment upon them. So when the Babylonians defeated Jerusalem, the king ordered his chief official to bring in some of the Israelites from the royal family and the nobility of Jerusalem. These would be the young men without any physical defect. Look at Daniel chapter 1, verses 3 through 7. Our actual verse for study today begins at verse 8. But he wants the men, young men. So we're talking 13, 14 to 17, 18-year-olds. Those who were handsome without defect, showing an aptitude for learning, who were quick to understand, and thus qualified to serve in his palace in Babylonia. And the Babylonians were to teach the young Jews the language and literature of the Babylonians, and thus use them in the king's service. And we learn in these verses of 4, it'd be Daniel and 3 of his friends. They were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Now you might say, I've never heard of those. Who are those? Well, the Babylonians changed those 3 friends' names from Hananiah to Shadrach, Mishael to Meshach, and Azariah to Abednego. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They also changed Daniel's name to Belteshazzar. But Daniel generally uses, in his book, his own name, Daniel. Other things were happening in the world at this same time. Let me see if I can't find those notes. David Guzik, who is a biblical scholar, compiler of scholarly writings, says that there were other world events taking place at the same time. There was the construction of the Acropolis in Athens. The Mayan civilization was flourishing in Mexico about this time. Aesop was writing his fables. Confucius and Buddha lived at this same time in other parts of the world. Greek art was beginning to excel. The Phoenicians made the first known sea journey around Africa. These things were beginning to occur in the world at this same time that we are studying. So let's look at our lesson for today, verses 8 through 21. I'm going to rush through just a little bit, but this story in today's lesson is well known to us, as are some of the stories we'll look at in the next 3 weeks before we get into the deep prophecy of the last couple of weeks of the book of Daniel. Some of these stories are well known. Today's story is about the food that was being served to the young Jewish men, teenagers, who were brought to be taught, brainwashed literally, into serving Nebuchadnezzar in his palace in Babylon. Another one of our lessons, we will look at Daniel in the lion's den. Another lesson is really going to be, it's one of my favorite because it is my foundation for belief, out of chapter 3 in the book of Daniel. And I have special reasons why it is so special to me, and I'll share that when we get there. But let's begin by looking at verses 8 through 14 of chapter 1. I'm reading from the New International. But Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine, and he asked the chief official for permission not to defile himself this way. Now God had caused the official to show favor and sympathy to Daniel, but the official told Daniel, "I'm afraid of my lord the king, who has assigned your food and drink. Why should he see you looking worse than the other young men your age? The king would then have my head because of you." Let's pause there for just a moment. Why is Daniel refusing to eat the king's food? And what is he doing with the king's food in the first place? Well, these young men of special abilities, even special looks and aptitudes, the king wanted them to become advisors in his kingdom. And to do so, he needed to brainwash them first. And by brainwash, I mean to indoctrinate them into the way he did things. But he's apparently heard that Jewish men are wise and learned and adapt to wisdom and discernment. And so he says, if I can make them or indoctrinate them into our way of life, I can get the advantage of not just slave labor, but of intellectual labor. And so he decided to take care of them and set them out on a 3-year training program. And he would take care of them, including feeding them with food even from his own, from the same food that is prepared for him at his table, including the wine. And Daniel did not want to defile himself. He resolved not to be defiled. But he's dealing in a difficult situation. Just like the superintendent who is attending to him knows, Daniel knows the king has provided this. And the king can be ruthless, especially at this time of the world's history, and especially in a non-God related kingdom. And so he goes to the servant who is attending to them and says, I don't want to eat the royal food. But he does so in a good way. He does so in such a way as to not appear to defy the king. Instead, he says, this is not good food for us. So what did he have against the food? It was the best food. Well, several conjectures. One, it probably included pork and horse meat. The Babylonians would eat horse meat. This is something the Jews would not. It would go against their instructions from the Mosaic food laws going back in history. Also, it's probably food that has been sacrificed to the god of the Babylonians or the various gods, and thus also prohibited for a Jew to eat. Now, there is no prohibition in the Jewish dietary laws against drinking wine, but this wine is also almost certainly something that has been offered as a sacrifice to the idols, and thus it has been polluted in the eyes of a devout Jew. And obviously, Daniel is a devout Jew. And so he says, I don't want to get you in trouble. I realize your fear that the king might be upset if he tells you to feed us this food and you feed us something less or something different. So let's do a test. He said in verse 11, Daniel then said to the guard whom the chief official had appointed over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, or Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, please test your servants for 10 days. Give us nothing but vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then compare our appearance with that of the young men who eat the royal food, and treat your servant in accordance with what you see. So he, that is the servant, agreed to do this and tested them for 10 days. Let's look at this test real quickly. It's just for 10 days. The training program is going to be for 3 years. There is really nothing about vegetables over meat that would cause one set of young men to look healthier than the other set of good men. So this is totally about obedience to God, and what God has told his people are part of their dietary laws, if you will. And it says vegetables, but it probably doesn't mean vegetables like your children or grandchildren refuse to eat. This just means food that comes from plants. So, or seeds, that come from seeds, which would include plants. And so it probably means nuts as well as vegetables. It probably includes fruits. There's advertising these days about fruits and vegetables being put in capsules and being taken, and that provides a quality of life. Daniel's not eating or taking capsules. He's actually eating the fruits and vegetables, the nuts, and other produce from seed, produced from seeds. And he says, we'll do it for 10 days. 10 days is not a real long time. but it's something that allows Daniel and his friends to comply with what they believe God's instructions are, even in a strange land, even under difficult circumstances, and yet not endanger the one whose job is to take care of them. So what does that really mean? It means that God intervenes on behalf of his children who are attempting to be obedient to him. We can gain a lesson from that. God will watch and care for his children who seek to be obedient to him and his word. So at the end of the 10 days, Daniel and his friends look healthier and better nourished than the others. Let's read verses 15 and 16. At the end of the 10 days, they looked healthier and better nourished than any of the young men who ate the royal food. So the guard took away their choice food and the wine they were to drink and gave them the vegetables instead. Psalm 33, 13 through 19 says that the Lord looks from heaven. He sees all of the sons of men. See if I can read that to us. Pull up my note. From heaven, the Lord looks down and sees all mankind. From his dwelling place, he watches all who live on earth. He who forms the hearts of all, who considers everything they do. No king is saved by the size of his army. No warrior escapes by his great strength. It is God who is looking out over them and for them because they are obeying his commands. I'm trying to, there we go. Daniel, by his actions, is an example to us of that encourages our faith. He exercised an uncomplicated, simple faith. It's all that God asks of us. A faith that said God is watching and God cares and God acts for those who are obedient to him. We as Christians really know that God seems to be blessed by what or can bless us with divine simplicity, if you will. The character of God makes all of the differences in the world. His character, not ours. So a spiritual lesson is provided here, not just a food lesson. I don't mind eating vegetables, but I'm not a vegetarian. The issue is not the food so much. It is the obedience that was exhibited by Daniel and his friends. Okay, we'll close with these verses 17 through 24. To these 4 young men, God gave knowledge and understanding of all kinds of literature and learning. He's talking about now through the remaining 3 years of their training. And Daniel could understand visions and dreams of all kinds. At the end of the time set by the king to bring them in, the chief official presented them to Nebuchadnezzar. The king talked with them, and he found none equal to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, whose names have been changed to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So they entered the king's service. In every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king questioned them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters in his whole kingdom. And Daniel remained there until the first year of King Cyrus. Now, who is King Cyrus? King Cyrus is the king of the Persians or the Medes and Persians, who ultimately defeated the Babylonians in 539 BC. Daniel starts serving, or he's carried off into exile around the age of 17 or 18 years of age. And he serves for 65 years until the Babylonians are defeated. We see over in, I think it's chapter 10, maybe it's chapter 12, that he is still around in the third year of Cyrus, king of the Medes and the Persians. And it is at that time that God convinces King Cyrus of the Medes and Persians to allow his people to leave exile and return to Jerusalem to rebuild their temple, to rebuild their nation, to repopulate their nation. Daniel serves in Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom for those 65 years, all the time being true to his God, Jehovah, and he is rewarded. And many believe he is allowed to return from exile. Where it says Daniel will remain there until the first year of King Cyrus, that's not saying that's when Daniel died. It just means he stayed in Nebuchadnezzar's government until the Babylonians were defeated. And then we see from other passages that he continued serving the new king, which is Cyrus. So what's our lesson this morning? It's an interesting lesson telling a tale that God rewards faith, God rewards obedience, and God provides knowledge and wisdom. So what is the beginning of wisdom? Proverbs chapter 1 verse 7 says, "The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and discipline." The fear means the awe, the worship of. Daniel is our example of how to worship our God, even when we find ourselves in situations where it would be easier to compromise what we believe in. He didn't. He remained true to God. He did so in a respectful way. We as Christians must be respectful when somebody opposes us, and they will. But we remain true to Christ, committed to our Savior, following the example of Daniel. An interesting lesson. There are interesting lessons remaining in Daniel. I'm looking forward to this study, and I want to invite you to come back and study and worship with us from the book of Daniel. Thank you, and good morning.